we had left off with the Treaty of Tortosias, which in addition to being something really fun to say, it is a treaty or an agreement between the major European powers involved in the initial conquest of the New World. Note that I said initial, so it's not just going to be Spain and Portugal that established colonies in the New World, but at the beginning, it's just them because they, called dibs, quote unquote, right? So what's important to note about the Treaty of Tordesillas is who it included and who it excluded, right? So the main players in this treaty are Spain, Portugal, which remember they're a part of the Iberian Peninsula, and the Pope. Remember, Spain and Portugal are both Catholic. How Catholic? Super Catholic. Okay. Now, the Pope doesn't want these two Catholic nations fighting each other over who gets what in the New World. Okay. So this is going to be an agreement between those three players to peacefully divvy up the New World territory between those two countries. Okay. Who did they not include in this treaty? Who do you think should have had a seat at the table there when it comes to dividing up the New World? Okay, not necessarily Africa, okay, because they're not colonizing Africa, remember? And Africa is also not colonizing anywhere in the New World. They're not exploring the New World. The Native Americans, good, TJ. Okay, so there had already been these mighty empires and already these peoples living in the New World. You have the Mississippian culture with the capital of Cahokia up here in the modern day United States. You have the Aztec in Mexico. You have the Inca in Peru. They were doing their own thing. And then you have Cortez and Pizarro and Columbus show up and you've got all these conquistadors. And that's when things really went downhill for the Native Americans. Okay, so in dividing up the New World, they do not ask the Native Americans. They don't say, hey, are you willing to sell this to us? Or can we come to an agreement where we get it on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, and y'all get it on Tuesday, Thursdays? Like, no, it's straight up, you're not even a part of this conversation, right? Which just shows the disdain that the Europeans had towards the Native Americans and the patronizing attitude of, oh, by conquering them, we're actually doing them a favor by quote unquote civilizing them and exposing them to Christianity. So Native Americans were not involved in this treaty. Okay, their power is taken away from them as colonial states. Also, they didn't ask any of the other European countries what they thought about divvying up the New World in this way. Because remember, England and the Netherlands and France, okay, they don't have any claim to the New World yet. Okay, so this is basically a monopoly on the New World and who gets what parts. Now, originally, the Pope is going to draw a line of demarcation right here, okay, which is going to give almost the entire New World to Spain, because everything to the left or the west of this red line belongs to Spain, and then everything to the right or the east of this line belongs to Portugal. But the original treaty only gave them this tiny little sliver of Brazil. That's going to change in 1494 when they move the line a little bit to the left, which gives more of Brazil, okay, to the Portuguese. So why is it that the Spanish got so much of this territory? Why didn't the Portuguese raise their hand and they're like, yeah, no, this definitely isn't 50-50. We want more of this land. Well, because the Portuguese erroneously believed that they would make more money focusing on Africa, but not the colonization of Africa, remember, because the Europeans couldn't colonize Africa, but instead on their trading port empire, using the western coast of Africa to get to Asia. Okay? Because what was in Asia that everyone wanted to get to? Not Coachella. Spice trade. Good, TJ. Okay, so they find this route with Vasco da Gama. They have access to the spice trade. That makes them crazy rich. They start enslaving African peoples along the western coast and importing them into their colony in Brazil to grow cash crops like sugar. That makes them rich. And also, they're making a lot of money off of the slave trade in general. So even though Spain gets all of this territory, and that seems really unfair for Portugal, Portugal was like, yeah, no, we don't really think that there's going to be a lot of money making opportunities in the New World. We're just going to stick with our colony in Brazil, and we're going to stick with focusing on Asia. But also, they copyrighted the asiento. They were granted exclusive rights to the African slave trade. So they're saying, hey, Spanish, you can't come in and start buying slaves in Africa. Okay. If you want people from Africa, then you're going to have to buy them from us. So basically creating a monopoly on the African slave trade. Now, the Portuguese aren't going to hold the asiento forever. Eventually, the Netherlands, the Dutch, take it away from them, and they also take away the spice trade from them with their Dutch East Indies Company, and then eventually the English, okay, come in and take over the asiento with their British East Indies Company, or British East India Company. Okay, so what you need to know about the Treaty of Tordesillas is, number one, who was involved and who wasn't involved, because that's important. And then number two, who got what? Spain got almost everything in the New World, with the exception of Brazil. Portugal got Africa, the route to Asia, and the asiento. And so when I try to think of who controlled what in the New World, at first, it's going to be mostly Spain, but eventually the English and the Dutch and the French start getting involved. So I start thinking about the languages of those areas. What language is predominantly spoken in Mexico? Spanish. So that would lead me to believe, hey, maybe it was Spain that conquered Mexico. What about in Peru and Colombia and Venezuela, all these areas in Latin America? Also Spanish, which makes sense that it culturally diffused from Europeans in Spain. Okay, the Aztec weren't speaking Spanish, and the Inca weren't speaking Spanish. They were speaking Quechua, right? And so it culturally diffused over due to conquest. What about in Brazil? What language do they speak in Brazil predominantly? Portuguese, which makes sense because they were a colony of Portugal. What about in the modern United States? What was the original mother country of the United States? England. So the majority language in the United States is English. Okay, what about in Canada? What languages do they speak? French and English. Good. So the French first come in and claim areas of Canada like Quebec, and then eventually the English take that territory from them. Okay, so if you ever get confused about who was the mother country of that colony or the other colony, think of what language they speak, and that's going to pretty accurately trace you back to whoever the mother country is. Okay, are we good on Treaty of Tortosias? Okay, so here's just a close-up of the map showing you the original line of demarcation, and this yellow line eventually gets moved further to the west to give more of Brazil to Portugal. But I want you to note how tiny Portugal is, y'all. Portugal is this tiny little empire in Europe, and then all of a sudden they start controlling a whole western coast to Asia and Brazil. They're going to have too small of a population and too little manpower to be able to successfully maintain that empire. That's when the Dutch come in and take it from it. And then eventually the English come in and take it from the Dutch. So the Spanish Empire is going to be a lot more extensive, and it's going to last a lot longer than the Portuguese Empire, even though the Portuguese technically got started first with Henry the Navigator funding expeditions around Africa to get to Asia. Okay, does that make sense so far? All right. So when we talk about historical thinking skills in this time period, we've already talked about causation in terms of, what were the causes and the effects of imperialism. The 3 G's were causes: God, gold, and glory. The effects were mostly negative demographic effects for the New World, negative demographic effects for Africa, positive economic effects for Europe. Okay, we can go on and on about being specific with that. So now let's look at another historical thinking skill of continuity and change. Now, which one do you think is going to be the easier part of this historical thinking skill to argue? Do you think there's more change or more continuity during this time period? Oh yeah, definitely, TJ. A lot of change as we go from period 1 to period 2. Okay, there's a whole change in that they find a whole new hemisphere. Okay, all this land that they didn't know existed. Okay, so definitely change is going to be the easier one to argue rather than continuity. Okay, so what are some political changes that old imperialism wrought upon the New World? Well, number one, the Americas are no longer controlled by Native American governments. Okay, do y'all know any Native American leaders or titles of leaders that we've talked about so far? Whew. They can be the names. Good. The Great Sun. That's a title. The Great Sun with the Mississippian population in North America. Okay. The Great Speaker with the Aztec, who's a representative of the gods. Okay. You have Pachacuti, the founder of the Incan Empire. You have Montezuma, the last emperor of the Aztec, Atahualpa, the last leader of the Inca. Okay, all of these people are Native American. This is prior to old imperialism. What about after old imperialism? You don't have Native American kings and emperors anymore. Instead, you have peninsulares, which are Europeans from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. You have the viceroys, who are Spanish governors. You have the audiencias, which are Spanish judges. You have the conquistadors. And do y'all know any names of any conquistadors? Cortez, who conquered the Aztec, and Pizarro, who conquered the Inca. Good. So you see a change over time from Native Americans being in charge to Europeans being in charge in the New World. Okay, now politically, how did they divide up the New World? Through the Treaty of Tortosias. So also a change over time in Europe. The Europeans finally get a golden age. Spain enters into its golden century. That's a big change over time. They go from having this land here. Let me change my pen. They go from having this much land to this much land. Okay, with Portugal, they go from having, oops, stop it. I'm trying to make it a different color. It's not working. They go from having this much land here to this much land. Okay, that's a change over time. The expansion of their borders to a maritime empire. So they're no longer just a land empire. Now they are a maritime empire. They have more clout. They have more power. They have more money. Okay, all those are political changes brought on by old imperialism. Does that make sense so far? All right. Now, the Spanish and the Portuguese weren't the only ones to get in on the imperialism and the colonization game, but they were the first ones. And since they were first, they called dibs. And we know that the Spanish could call dibs, quote unquote, because the Spanish had used the money, the profit from exploration to fund their navy, the Armada. So they controlled the Atlantic Ocean, preventing any other European countries from coming in and taking over their territory in the New World. But Spain isn't going to be top dog forever. Okay, next one in charge is going to be England when they defeat the Spanish Armada, when the Catholic king tries to kill their Catholic queen. And we're going to talk about that war when we get to the next folder in our series after the DBQ. Okay, so what were the causes behind these three countries, the Netherlands, England, and France, being so slow to imperialize? Well, number one, the Dutch were more interested in Asia. Okay, they had a capital of Amsterdam within the Netherlands that was a financial capital. So you think like banking, lots of money going through that capital for trade. And then also they founded these joint stock companies, which y'all know what stock companies are. Okay, you can buy or sell stocks on the stock market, and if you buy like really good stock, then it can appreciate and you can get more money. If you buy awful stock, then you might lose all of your money in the stock market. Okay, but typically people don't invest their entire life savings into the stock market. It's not like they're like, I'm going to go bet that Ohio State will beat Alabama in the national championship. Let me bet $27,000 at once. Like, no, that's way too much risk. Okay, and also you really shouldn't bet against Alabama in a football game. So yes, I mean, like, yeah, definitely, duh. So not a lot of people were willing to put a ton of money into these explorations, and not a lot of people had that kind of money. I mean, yeah, the kings and the queens were funding expeditions. They were like, here, conquistadors, here, explorers, here's some ships and some food and a crew, and I'm going to pay all your wages so you can sail west. Like, yeah, the king and queen can do that because they're the king and the queen. All right. But, you know, your normal merchant or noble lord isn't going to have it like that. Okay. But they still want to secure the bag. So what can they do? They can give smaller amounts of money to these joint stock companies like the Dutch East India Company or the Dutch West India Company. And whatever profits brought back by those companies, they get whatever percentage that they put in. So if they buy 20% of the company's stocks, then they get 20% of the company's profits, right? But then if they lose everything, like let's say they put $100 into the Dutch East India company and the ships all sink on their way back and they make zero money, well, then you're only out $100. You're not out of your entire life savings. Okay, so this is going to allow for basically like crowdfunding of exploration rather than just individual monarchs funding it. Okay, so the Dutch are more interested in Asia, hence their focus on these joint stock companies. And eventually they're going to take that trade route around Africa that the Portuguese discovered for themselves. And they're going to kick the Portuguese out of Asia, actually. England and France were also busy with their own stuff. They were like not emotionally in the right place for colonization. They were involved in a lot of wars, mostly with each other. The English and the French hate each other. And this dates back to the 100 Years' Wars, which was ironic because it actually lasted 116 years. Okay, but it sounds catchier to just say the 100 Years' War. So with this, they were fighting. England invaded France. It was this whole big deal. And they're going to be bitter about it even going forward. Part of the reason that the French helped the United States in the American Revolution isn't because they believed in democracy. I mean, they had a king and the queen themselves, but more so they were just trying to stick it to the British. It wasn't like they believed in the cause of the American Revolution. They were just like, oh, you're fighting the British? Here's some guns. Go for it, right? Also, you're going to have civil wars in England that distract them from the whole colonization thing. Like the War of the Roses is between two feuding families in England. Spoiler alert, the Tudor family wins, and they end up ruling England for a minute. And then the English Civil War is a religious war. Again, we had the Protestant Reformation in the 1520s, which led to conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. Now, what religion are the Protestants? They're Christian. What religion are the Catholics? Also Christian. But they disagreed about who was the right Christian, who loved Jesus the right way or the most. And so they killed each other and tortured each other over it. Kind of like we're going to see that in the Reconquista with Ferdinand and Isabella. They establish an inquisition that actually tries to root out heretics. And in addition to Muslims and Jews, they add Protestants to that list because the Protestants take their communion a little bit different. And so they must be going to hell, right? And then in France, you have so many wars of religion over this exact same thing of Christians fighting Christians, Protestants versus Catholics. You have the Smalcaldan Wars. You have the War of the Three Henrys. Guess who won? Henry. You have the 30 Years' War, okay, which was over the Protestants and the Catholics trying to kill each other. Okay, so they were going through something, you know, during this time period. So they weren't as involved in colonization at first, and plus Spain had kind of, you know, already called dibs. But once England and France do get involved in the Columbian Exchange, they start looking for a way to get through the Americas. And what I mean by that is they're going to try to find something called a Northwest Passage. Now, y'all may remember Ferdinand Magellan. He was the first guy, or his crew was the first crew to circumnavigate the world, which means he went from Europe around the southern tip of the Americas, back through the Indian Ocean, around the southern tip of Africa to get back to home base. But it took him a year to do that, guys. That's not that great of a time, right? You want to get from destination A to B as quickly as possible, because the more time you spend getting there, the less money you're making. And so they say, okay, well, Christopher Columbus, when he sailed west, he ended up here, okay, in the Caribbean, and they figured, oh, we can just go through this land. There's probably something in here that, like a canal or a waterway, like a river, that will let us go through and get to the Pacific Ocean. Well, they couldn't find one here in Middle America, Mesoamerica, and the way around Southern America or South America was too far, it was too long, and so they tried to go this way. Okay, now obviously that's not going to work. There is no Northwest Passage. I mean, that's obvious to us because we have modern maps. But back then, remember, they were exploring. They didn't know what was all up here. They didn't know Canada was a thing until they finally start looking around. Okay, so the English and the French start sending explorers to North America to see, hey, is there a waterway through here that can get us to the Pacific Ocean faster than if we go around the south? Now, spoiler alert, they're never going to find it. Okay, but they try. The English are going to send John Cabot, and the British, that is English. The French are going to send Jacques Cartier, which some of my former classes over the years have just been like, Jacques Cartier. And I'm like, okay, fine. It's a written test. They're not going to test you on how you pronounce it. If pronouncing it Jacques helps you remember how to spell it better, then by all means. And John Cabot. So they both try to find a Northwest Passage. They fail, but while they're there, they just claim stuff for their mother country. Because remember, under mercantilism, the purpose of the colonies is to enrich the mother country. And do they care that people are already living on that territory? No, they do not. Are we good so far? All right, so just to recap the different empires in the Americas to give you a visual of who controlled what. Spain obviously is going to have the most Champlain. Yes, there is, but we don't cover all of the explorers. We cover like the hits, the top 10 or so. So like even Bartholomew Diaz, like we don't talk about that much. We don't talk about De Soto, but y'all, if you have information like that, that's fair game to use as SFI on a DBQ or an LEQ or an SAQ or anything like that in the AP curriculum, because you can give any specific factual evidence, and as long as it backs up your claim, you're good to go. So New Spain, you're going to see that like mostly these areas, they're just going to call them New something. Like here we have New Sweden, New Plymouth Colony, New York, New Amsterdam. Okay, so they're basically just going to take the names of stuff in Europe and then be like, new in front of it, and they're like, haha, new colony just dropped. So obviously the majority of the New World is going to be claimed by Spain through the Treaty of Tortosias, but then they're going to lose some of that territory as they lose power. So that's what we see here in orange. Over here in yellow, we see the Portuguese holdings. Okay, remember Brazilians speak Portuguese, so that can help you remember that it was the colony of Portugal. But then we start seeing these other European countries get involved. You're going to see the English, especially here along the 13 original colonies of the United States. The French are going to have Haiti, which later Haiti is going to have a revolution where they overthrow the French and they become a free nation. They're actually the first country in the New World to outlaw slavery. The Haitians are. Brazil is the last one to outlaw slavery in 1888. Okay, so even after the Civil War in the United States, in 1865. Okay, so Brazil's kind of, behind the curve there. But the United States and Haiti were the only two countries in the New World to actually have a full-blown war over the issue of slavery and the abolition of slavery, and they were both successful. The French, like I said before, they're going to hold Haiti, and they're going to establish some colonies in Quebec, but for the most part, they're going to be nomadic. Okay, there's not a lot of gold and silver up in Canada. Let's go ahead and let you know. Can't really grow any cash crops up in Canada. I don't know if y'all have heard, but it gets pretty cold. So what's there that could make the French wealthy? Not cash crops, not gold and silver, instead animals. Okay, they're going to get super involved in the fur trade. Now, with being involved in the fur trade, you don't really settle down, right? You can't just like sit on some land and wait for animals to come through. You have to hunt them. You have to follow them and follow their migratory patterns. And so the French aren't going to settle down much in Canada. They're not going to take as much land from the Native Americans. So of all the of all the Europeans, the Native Americans hate the French the least. They're like, you're the least bad of the European countries. Okay, because the French treat them better. They don't take as much of their territory because, again, what is their economic interest? Fur. So they don't need to claim a lot of land for the fur trade. Okay, and long-term effect, that's going to lead to the Native Americans siding with the French in the French and Indian War, which guess who the French are fighting? The British. Okay, but guess who wins? The British. So instead of siding with the British, the Native Americans sided with the French because the French were nicer to them. British, really not nice to the Native Americans. Okay, especially since the British were coming over in large numbers to settle, right? Entire families, not just men, but also women and children. And they wanted to grow crops on that land, which means they claimed the land and established it with their own borders, which really ticked off the Native Americans who had been there first, right? So the Native Americans are not going to look as fondly on the incursions of the British in their New World compared to the French. Okay, we good so far? All right. Like I said earlier, the Dutch are going to establish East India companies and West India companies in order to access trade in Asia. They're going to first form under government sponsorship, which means the government gives them money and provides them with everything they need for this trade. And then the Dutch ships go en route to the spice trade. And then eventually it's going to expand into a joint stock company where nobles, non-royalty, can invest and make a profit off of the spice trade. Okay, but remember that the Portuguese had a monopoly on this trade. They had controlled the western coast of Africa to get to the Indian Ocean. Well, the Dutch are going to take that from them, and they're going to take it militarily. Okay, in addition to taking their route around Africa, they're also going to take the slave trade in Africa and claim it for themselves and kick the Portuguese out of the Indian Ocean. Okay, so the Portuguese fall, their golden age is over. And then in the 17th century, you have the rise of the Dutch. And then even eventually, they're going to start fighting Spain for territory in the New World, notably New Amsterdam, although the British are going to take that from them. Okay, so the Asiento shifts from being the Portuguese to belonging to the Dutch, and then eventually the English take the Asiento away from the Dutch. Are we good so far? Does anyone need this slide? All right. Some of the explorers that the French and the British sent over to the New World include Jacques Cartier. Again, tried to find the Northwest Passage, but he failed. Instead, he found a river, and he found Quebec. And, well, no, he didn't find Quebec, sorry. But others after him founded Quebec. But again, the French aren't going to have as much territory or settled territory compared to the British. Now, the British come in pretty late. One, because the Spanish didn't want them involved. So first they had to beat the Spanish in combat. And then when the explorers from Britain, like John Cabot, came around, they found that there wasn't a lot of gold and silver in North America. Remember, Who had the gold and silver? The Aztec and the Inca. The Aztec are in Mexico. The Inca are in Peru. Okay, United States, not a lot of gold. Okay, but you don't just make profit from gold and silver, you can also make profit from cash crops. So that's where they're going to shift their attention. Once they start establishing permanent settlements, they're going to start establishing plantations for the growing of tobacco and cotton, most notably. Okay. Now, unlike the French, so if you're doing comparison between the French and the British in the New World, unlike the French, who were nomadic and focused on the fur trade, the British are going to be focused more on settlement. And so a ton of English people come to the New World, much more than France and Spain and Portugal. Remember, Spain and Portugal, they were sending some Europeans, mostly men, but then those men would marry into the different classes in the New World, and that's where you get the casta system. The French, they weren't bringing their women and children with them while they're off, hunting animals for fur pelts. They would leave them behind in Europe. Okay, so you don't have a lot of people coming from France and Spain and Portugal to the New World compared to the English, which are sending entire ships of people, families and indentured servants and missionaries over to their colonies in North America. Are we good so far? All right, again, continuity and change over time. We're going to continue to see the negative effects of the Columbian exchange and old imperialism on the New World. So these cultural and social changes are mostly going to be negative for the Native Americans. In terms of culture, aspects of culture can include religion, it can include written works, it can include language, food, clothing, traditions. Almost all of that is going to be completely wiped out by the Europeans. In addition to a literal death from exploration, the Native Americans are also going to suffer cultural death. Okay, because remember, the Spanish and the Portuguese and the conquistadors were Catholic. How Catholic? Super Catholic. And the Native Americans weren't, which, I mean, it's not their fault. Like, they'd never heard of this Jesus guy, right? But then the Europeans show up and they say, love Jesus or die, right? And so they get rid of what they consider heresy. Heresy is a crime against God, going against God's teachings. And what is the punishment for heresy? Death. Okay, even in Europe, they're going to kill other Christians because they're the wrong kind of Christians. Okay, so the whole issue the Catholics have with the Protestants and the Muslims and the Jews is that they don't follow their rules, they don't follow the Pope. And so that's going to lead to almost 100 years worth of wars in Europe over religion, as well as the Reconquista, right? So they're definitely not going to look fondly upon or look kindly upon, say, human sacrifice or a polytheism or a sun god, right? So the Spanish and the Portuguese come in and they're like, yeah, no, we got to get rid of all of this heresy. They figured they were doing the Native Americans a favor by converting them and saving their eternal souls. They're like, oh yeah, okay, there's slavery, but think about the afterlife. Well, okay, still pretty negative. And so with that, they're going to destroy a lot of the literature and the history of the Native American peoples that they exploit. This is also going to change their social structures, whereas prior to the Columbian exchange, the population was entirely Native. And you had Native Americans at the top, middle, bottom throughout the entire hierarchy. The great son, the great speaker, merchants, warriors, human sacrifices. Change over time, we're going to see the development of the casta system. Okay, peninsulares, Creoles, mestizos, mulattoes, zombos, indigenous peoples, Africans. Okay, so they're no longer at the top of society. That's delegated to the Europeans in the casta system. Also, we don't have a lot of primary sources from the natives about after colonization or like during colonization. Not because they weren't educated enough to read or write. I mean, obviously they could. They had their own language and their own written form of Mayan glyphs, right? But the only, or one of the very few surviving examples of primary sources of the indigenous languages is the Florentine Codex. So that's where we're able to use it as a codex. We're able to use it to decode some of the surviving texts that we have from those once mighty empires. Okay, but most of those works are going to be literally lit on fire by the Europeans as they come through and they try to eliminate everything that they consider heretical. So even during colonization, we don't have a lot of sources written by the Native Americans as firsthand accounts. Instead, the Spanish conquistadors and the priests like Bartholomew de las Casas are going to write down what happened. Now, obviously, there's going to be a bias in that. Clearly, they're going to write in such a way that they are appealing to an audience, okay, or they are seeing things through their perspective, and you don't really have the perspective of the Native Americans or the Africans added to that historical record. Now, that doesn't mean that the Spanish conquistadors and priests are all going to write, complete lies. Okay, it's not like they're obviously going to have a bias towards wanting to make their mother country look good, but you do have some people like Bartholomew de las Casas, who wrote an account of the destruction of the Indies, where he's going to give us some insight into the genocide that was going on during exploration under the Spanish. Although, unfortunately for the Catholics, the Protestants are going to use that as anti-Catholic propaganda. Are we good so far? All right. Additional cultural and social changes. As the Catholic Church sends more Christian missionaries trying to convert the Inca and Aztec and other natives to the Christian religion, we're going to see again cultural syncretism, meaning that you take different aspects of two different cultures and you combine them together to make something new. Now, when the Spanish missionaries were coming over and telling them all about Jesus, Joseph, and the Virgin Mary, right? Sometimes they would bring over some art. Remember, this is after the Renaissance, and during the Renaissance, they were painting all sorts of religious paintings and figures and statues. Remember, because Catholics love icons. They are pro-icon. Eastern Orthodox, anti-icon. Muslims, they don't use icons of holy figures or images of holy figures, right? The Catholics, though, they are all about icons. So they're bringing a bunch of those icons over to the New World. But here's the thing. When they depict Jesus and the Mother Mary, the Madonna, and Joseph, or God even in their paintings, they look a lot like the Europeans, right? Well, the Native Americans and also the Africans in the New World are instead going to synchronize that information to better reflect their faith. So in the indigenous religions, there was a concept of a mother god. And so they're like, okay, mother god, and then Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. We're just going to kind of combine those two. The Virgin of Guadalupe traces back to a vision that a native claimed to have had where the Virgin Mary came down from heaven and spoke with him. And so when she appeared, she looked more like the natives. She did not look European. Okay, which makes sense considering, the birthplace of Jesus was the Middle East, and he and Joseph and Mary spent his formative years in Egypt, right? And then also with the diffusion of African culture into the New World, we know that it was primarily Islam that came from Africa, but then you also have the Bantu mystical animistic religions that have like a lot of magical shamanistic aspects to it. Well, that African aspect of religion is going to combine with Christianity to create Vodun, which you may have heard colloquially called voodoo. Okay, that's going to be in Haiti. So we have an example of religious syncretism with Africa and the New World, with the creation of Vodun, Christianity, plus the animistic religions of the Western Africans. We have an example with the Native Americans combining their concept of a mother god with the Virgin Mary, and then also just the depictions of the holy figures to reflect the population that believes in them. The Europeans paint their holy figures as white. The Africans paint their holy figures as black. the Native Americans paint their holy figures as, you know, looking like them as indigenous. Okay. Are we good so far? All right, excellent. Again, other social change, the social hierarchy. All right, at the top, the Peninsulares, they came from the Iberian Peninsula. What two countries are on the Iberian Peninsula? Two countries in the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. Spain and Portugal, perfect, okay? So the Peninsulares are Europeans. And they have the most power out of anybody in this hierarchy, even though their children, the Creoles, are Europeans born in the New World and thus are Caucasian. The Creoles are not going to have as much power as the Peninsulares, and that's actually going to tick the Creoles off a lot. So they're going to like host revolutions and declare independence, but that's going to be later in period 3. We'll get to that eventually. Creole is also a language. It's the syncretic language of African languages plus European languages. So like in Louisiana, Creole is spoken a lot. In Haiti, Creole is spoken a lot. So there's two different definitions for Creole. Okay, they're both nouns. One refers to a group of people born in the New World who are European. And the other meaning for Creole means a language, a combination of European language and African language. Okay. With castas just means the mixed races. Okay. What heritage are the mestizos? What races are they descended from? Remember, we have 3 in the New World now: the Europeans, the Africans, and the Native Americans. Now I can hear y'all typing, but you can like say it out loud if you prefer that.
Spanish and Native American.
Good. You have the Europeans and the Native Americans. Okay. What about the mulattoes? Spanish and African. Good. What about zombos? African and Native American. Good, TJ. And that ends the castas. That ends the mixed races. Then at the bottom, you have the Native Americans, the indigenous, and the enslaved peoples kidnapped from Africa. Okay. This is a big change over time, but then eventually it becomes a continuity. So if you're talking about from period 1 to period 2, this is a change over time. You go from all indigenous to 3 different races. But then as you go from period 2 to period 3 and period 4, this racial system is a continuity. That even today, there is racial discrimination in South America and in Mexico, okay, based on race. Okay, so that's something that we can see as an unfortunate continuity into the modern age. We good so far? All right. So the Spanish and the Portuguese are the first to colonize the New World. They call dibs first, but then eventually they're going to lose their power, especially with the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English. And so that means that the other European colonies are going to start scrambling for their own colonies to compete with the Spanish and the Portugal, because they see that Spain and Portugal went through their own golden age. And they're like, hey, I would also like to have a golden age, please. So their explorers are going to be sent to look for that northwest passage through Canada to the Pacific Ocean. They're not going to find it. Okay. They're also not going to find gold. They're not going to find silver. They're not going to find cash crops that can grow in Canada. Instead, they find other valuable resources. And that starts the very profitable fur trade for the French. Okay. So the French are going to start this fur trade, which means that they're going to be more nomadic. They rarely settle permanently. So this is a cause, okay, because of the fur trade. The French don't really settle down in the New World. Because of that, the effect is the French have better relationships with the Native Americans. Okay. The long-term effect of that is going to be the Native Americans siding with the French in the French and Indian War against the British, also known as the 7 Years' War. So if you see that 7 Years' War or French and Indian War, they are the same war. Okay, if you're saying your Cornell notes stopped on that last slide, that's fine. We only have a few more slides left here, so y'all should be able to type this information into your Cornell notes. And again, this is being recorded and I'll have it up on YouTube. So if we don't, or if I move too fast through the slide for what's typed, okay, that's fine. I'll have it posted for y'all, but I really want to finish this lecture before we dismiss for today, okay? All right. English colonies, after they defeat the Spanish Armada, that's when they start controlling the seas. And so the Spanish Armada no longer controls the oceans. Now England is the mighty maritime power with their own navy. And so they, like the Spanish, want to start colonizing the Americas. They start forming settlements, however, where they have a lot of people ending up there. So they found the colony of Virginia, which is named Virginia after Elizabeth II. No, sorry, the first. The second is the one we've got currently. Elizabeth I. Okay, she was called the Virgin Queen because she never got married. Okay, never got married, never had kids, and so she's called the Virgin Queen. Thus, when they founded this colony, they named it Virginia in her honor. Within Virginia, there was the settlement of Jamestown, which was named after her inheritor. Wasn't her son, it was her godson, but she also had killed his mom. Long story. So in the settlement of Jamestown, you had a bunch of people moving over because they're like, hey, I hear there's a bunch of land in the New World and I can make money. Well, they weren't used to working hard. Okay, and so they didn't really like do the work to grow crops to have enough food for the winter. So a lot of people died, right? Until a governor came along and said, okay, look, if you don't work, you don't eat. It's as simple as that. So you need to get to work. And so he turns that colony around, makes it so that more settlers can survive. And that's when they discover, hey, this cash crop, tobacco, could make us really rich. Okay, and we're in a temperate climate that would allow for pretty successful agriculture, especially when they start taking over the Asiento and start importing people from Africa. Okay, so that's where we're going to start seeing the foundation of the modern slave states in the United States. Are we, oh, they're on the Cornell notes on page 9? Okay, so maybe just got jumbled up a little bit. Are we good on this slide so far? Okay, so the English start sending a lot more people than the other European countries. That's not going to endear them to the Native Americans. Okay, so speaking of the profit made by cash crops, the majority of the people that are working in the South, okay, are going to be forced labor from the Asiento. So slaves are going to be imported to the southern modern United States to grow cash crops like tobacco and cotton. Whereas in the North, you're going to see more indentured servants. So indentured servitude and slavery are different. And indentured servitude is like, imagine that I'm poor, which, you know, isn't really that much of a leap of imagination. And I live in Europe, but I want to come to the Americas. Well, I can't buy my own ticket. Like I said, I'm poor. So I have to find somebody else to buy my ticket for me. Well, if someone's just going to be like, oh yeah, here's a ticket for free, no worries, go have a good life. No, they're going to want something in exchange for paying for that ticket. And so I enter into a contract with them. I say, okay, if you get me to the New World, because I hear there's a bunch of land out there and I could, you know, probably get rich after this, I will work for you for free for 7 years. So I signed this contract to work for this person for 7 years, and yeah, it's gonna suck. Like, they treat indentured servants pretty badly, but it's not slavery. Okay, I entered into this willingly and I got something out of it. I benefited in some way from this contract. I got to come to the New World, and that was a decision that I wanted to make, and I did so. Very different than what we see with the Asiento. Okay, kidnapping and forcing them into the New World with zero benefit whatsoever. Okay, so if you're comparing and contrasting similarities and differences between indentured servitude and slavery, well, number one, you're going to see more indentured servants in the North and more slaves in the South. Also, indentured servitude is voluntary compared with slavery, which is involuntary. Indentured servitude is not based on race, whereas the Asiento was based on race. The indentured servitude is temporary and not hereditary. Whereas slavery was permanent and it was hereditary. Okay. So you can even compare that with old world slavery from before the age of imperialism, where old world slavery, yes, was involuntary, but it wasn't racial, it wasn't permanent, and it wasn't hereditary. New world slavery is all of these things. Indentured servitude is all of these things. So already in this lecture, y'all, we've covered causes and effects, we've covered continuity and change, and now we've covered comparison. Okay, so similarities and differences. Are there any questions so far? All right. The Dutch are also going to explore a little bit in the New World. They are going to form a place called New Amsterdam. Remember, they just put new in front of things. This is like near New York, but they're not going to hold on to that territory very long. England really dominates North America, even kicking the French out of Canada at one point. Okay, so like the Dutch took away territory from Portugal, remember, and they took the slave trade as well. Netherlands. The English are going to go around and do the same thing to the Netherlands. So first, Portugal had territory in the New World and had control of the slave trade and access to the Indian Ocean. Then the Netherlands, the Dutch, take that from them. Then the England take that from the Dutch. So you see, it just gets passed down the road there. Any questions, comments, concerns so far? All right, final slide. Another long-term impact on the New World. Okay, again, yet another negative impact was the environmental impact. We talked about the social, we talked about the cultural, we talked about the political, we talked about the demographic. Now let's look at the environmental effect. Okay, one, deforestation, getting rid of the trees. Why were they getting rid of the trees? Because they wanted fields to grow crops. Okay, so they would burn the trees and they would use the ashes to replenish the soil. But the issue with burning the trees, in addition to, pollution, is that it destroys those root systems that were holding the soil in place. So as a result of deforestation, you get soil depletion and erosion. Because they're growing so many cash crops, and those cash crops need a ton of water, that means it's going to drain their clean water resources, meaning that there's less clean water for the population. Instead, it's being used in order to grow these cash crops to maximize the profit for the mother country under mercantilism. So the Europeans weren't concerned with maintaining the community or maintaining these resources for future generations. It was more like, it's my money and I want it now sort of mentality. Let's say, oh yeah, there's all this land, there's always going to be more land and more territory, so who cares what we do with this? Burn it all down, grow cash crops. Once we destroy the soil, we just go find new soil and keep taking more territory in order to fund our mercantilist policies. Okay, so again, mostly negative effects for the Americas, not just the people living there, but like the literal territory.